One of the most frustrating aspects of arguing with people online is the way the internet as a communication environment structurally rewards arguments that are quippy and intuitive to the almost exclusion of anything counterintuitive or complicated. Arguments whose essence can be distilled into a tweet or 30-second TikTok clip carry infinitely greater weight than lengthy diatribes where arguments are expounded in full. The former is simply shareable in a way that the latter isn't, capable of sinking itself into the mind with minimum effort. Edutainment used to be a subcategory of video game and TV show where children were taught the basics of math by funny animated animals. It's now how an entire generation of leftists are receiving their political education. The problem this poses is immediate. Radicalism is not intuitive, nor intuition radical. If they were, everyone would already be a radical, and there would be little need for political agitation and education. On the contrary, almost every cognitive bias that forms the bedrock of intuition instead has a distinctly conservative bias. One bias is literally called the status quo bias, and the generally conservative implications of other biases, such as the recency bias, are clear. Of course, intuition is often invaluable, and it's never entirely ignorable, so there's no sense in declaring it an enemy of the revolution, but it has to be handled with care. This is why we read theory in the first place. Curiously, what I identify as a problem is viewed by many as an opportunity. Where Marx declared in the preface to the Communist Manifesto that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, many today do nothing of the sort. The contemporary left is overcome by fear, so it's no surprise that we contort ourselves to adhere as closely as possible to the common sense of the very society we seek to transcend. That isn't to say we don't challenge the conclusions of capitalist common sense. Rather, we reach different conclusions by way of the same logic. It's not without reason that so many of the most popular socialists today, like Richard Wolff and the disgraced debate streamer Vosh, conceive socialism as the fulfillment of a promise made but not kept by capitalism. The worst defense of China is not so blatant in its liberal premises, but in some respects this makes it worse. With figures like Wolff and Vosh, even if what they openly in the face of the world publish is not communism, they make little pretense to the contrary. They are forthrightly liberal and can be regarded as such without issue. Their popularity among communists speaks more to a lack of clarity about our own ideas than it does to any deception on their part. The worst defense of China has the audacity to style itself revolutionary even as it goes to bat for an imperialist power. I've beaten around the bush on what this defense actually is, in part because it's not actually a defense at all. There's very little to say about it other than to analyze it symptomatically. It's the worst not because it's the most wrong, but because it's not even wrong. It amounts to a declaration that the subject is categorically beyond comprehension and therefore pointless to discuss. To allow one of the argument's most vocal proponents to articulate it in her own words,
"This might be a hot take, but I just have to say it. Anytime I hear a Western leftist criticizing China and saying that they're not doing socialism or they're doing imperialism or whatever the fuck, all I hear is, who's smarter, me or a million Chinese communists? It's obviously me, right? No, Western leftists, you're not smarter than a million Chinese communists. You've never been in charge of a country in your entire life. You've never even been in charge of a large-scale system, probably. So who are you to tell China what to do?"
There is nothing remotely Marxist about this argument. Where Marx called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists, internet pseudo-communists declare China off limits. It's not that the Western chauvinism and Orientalism being described does not exist, because it absolutely does, and it poisons almost all mainstream discourse around the subject. But there is a rhetorical sleight of hand at play here that is, frankly, beneath Marxism. It's not even particularly subtle, but it is papered over by enough moralism and faux intersectionality that one feels pressured to not look too closely at it out of consideration for the magician. Allow me to play masked Marxist. In effect, Those who defended China this way want you to conflate two very distinct things: the party state and the proletariat. To accomplish this, they conflate the two themselves, and in all likelihood, genuinely believe the two to be functionally interchangeable. The Chinese party-state bureaucracy becomes millions of Chinese communists, making the circular logic that follows possible. The argument presupposes the authenticity of China's socialist character, presupposes the Chinese Communist Party is an authentic repository of the Chinese proletariat's political will. Consequently, to question China becomes to question the Chinese people, something that would be chauvinistic. This rhetorical magic trick performed, the critic is disarmed, stripped of their capacity for effective argument. And it is important to stress, the point is to disarm critics, not refute them. Arguments such as these do not exist for the sake of those not already persuaded, but to solidify the faith of those who already believe. One is reminded of Pascal's wager, wherein it is rational to bet on God's existence since the potential reward is infinite, and the potential downside non-existent. This argument is infamously useless in converting non-Christians, but has nevertheless been a staple apologetic since its invention in the 1500s. It exists for the sake of the Christians making the argument, not the non-believers Christians address it to. Were the critics not disarmed, the faith of believers reinforced, those sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party and its state may have to wrestle with the disconcerting fact that, when the Chinese proletariat takes to the barricades, the CCP lines up with the cops on the opposing side. When employees at the Shenzhen Jasik technology plant, incensed by a combination of low pay, long hours, and dangerous working conditions, attempted to form an independent union outside the officially sanctioned state apparatus, the CCP launched raids on organizers' apartments, interrogated those involved for months afterwards, and forced student organizations that expressed solidarity with the workers to disband. Far from an isolated incident, this is routine. Of course, when one so closely identifies the CCP with the Chinese proletariat, proletarian self-activity that comes into conflict with the CCP begins to look a lot like subversive activity. After all, there do exist official channels for workers to express their complaints through, so why strike? And thus, our magician has performed the greatest feat of all. The working class has magically been transformed into Marxism's greatest enemy rather than its beating heart. That is why I claim this argument takes advantage of the preconceptions of a non-radical audience. It is intuitive to those raised in a liberal capitalist society to equate people with their government, to see geopolitics principally in terms of competing nation-states. In reality, states exist to advance the interests of their national bourgeoisie, not a class-neutral national interest, let alone a proletarian interest. Nations as we understand them today arose alongside capitalism in the 18th century, a product of what Leon Trotsky called the uneven and combined development of capitalism. Were the interests of capital uniform and capable of being represented by a world government, they would be. Of course, there are potential responses to my arguments here. Marxists of all people ought to understand that discourse is rarely ended by words. As Marx said, man must prove the truth, i.e. the reality and power, the this-sidedness of his thinking, in practice. But discourse is still worth having, because it's not scholastic. Internationalism is a foundational principle of Marxist political action, and a lot rides on if one believes internationalism dictates we stand in solidarity with the Chinese state or the Chinese working class. Those who believe the former benefit greatly from not having this discussion at all, because intuition is on their side. Radicals can and must do better if we want to change the world. There's no other goal worth having.